Welcome everybody to the first webinar of the Society of Wetland Scientists of Canada. The board is made up of myself, Marianne Perrin, and Nicole Wright, and we revived the chapter. We thought about it a year ago, and we started to get really active about half a year ago. So I'll just give a brief introduction to us and what we're trying to do, and then I'll turn it over to Nicole, who's going to introduce our speaker. Marianne Perrin is a postdoctoral researcher at the St. Lawrence River Institute, and she's also cross-appointed to University of Ottawa. Her research has been in constructed pond systems and wetland biodiversity, and we've had gorgeous dragonfly photos from her. She's also a dragonfly expert. Nicole Wright is a hydrologist and wetland scientist at Ecofish Research in BC, it's a consulting company. Her doctoral research was in peatland hydrology in the Northwest Territories. And I'm a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at Guelph with research in biogeochemical cycling of metals and wetlands, and also in vegetation of mine tailings. So just briefly, our goal for SWS Canada is to provide a forum for wetland scientists at all levels, from academic and government to industry professionals. So although many of us belong to other societies, we found that there is no other national organization in Canada that's specific for wetland science. So it seemed like an important gap to fill and a good way to bring together the diversity of Canadian scientists who work in wetlands. So our newsletter this month provided updates on what we're working on. We'll keep sending those updates, and I won't repeat that here, except to say that we're still looking for a treasurer. We're also looking for potentially students who are interested in helping us out with social media. That's our next step. We're debating the social media platform to use. So if anyone has input on that, we decided on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and we may be changing that. And there's still free memberships available for students and early career professionals. So if you're interested in that, contact the Society of Wetland Scientists directly. I don't know, I've been calling it our mothership. It's the main office of SWS in the US, which is in Wisconsin. And just mention to whatever email you write to there, it's on their front page. Mention that you're applying for a free membership to the Canada chapter, and they'll direct you. So I will turn this over to Nicole now. And thanks for coming.
Thank you, Susan. We're really pleased today to have Kailyn Nelson to talk on peatland and fire interactions and feedbacks, which is a particularly important topic with the climate change and increasing wildfires we're seeing. Kailyn's a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Lethbridge. Her research focuses on the impacts of fire on boreal peatlands, specifically peat combustion and carbon loss, and she uses lidar and field data to do her research. And without further ado, thank you so much, Kailyn. It's all yours.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm just going to share my screen here so everybody can see my slides. All right. Should be good to go. All right. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I'm really appreciative to be here to talk to you all. As Nicole said, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Lethbridge. And today I'm going to talk to you about how wildland fire and peatlands interact specifically within Canada's boreal forest. And more specifically, we're going to focus on how these interactions are shifting with climate change and what the implications of this are. So before I start, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that all research in Canada has been conducted on ancestral lands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, whether that's treaty or unceded land. Where I work, the University of Lethbridge is located on Treaty 7 territory, specifically the traditional land of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And the land my research is based upon is Treaty 8 land. That's a little bit north. And that's the traditional territory of the Cree, the Dene, and the unceded territory of the Métis. And throughout my talk today, I'm going to talk about research that's been conducted across Canada's boreal forest. And the boreal forest spans treaty land, unceded land. And today there are more than 600 primarily Indigenous communities in the Canadian boreal, many of which continue to practice their longstanding traditions and uses of this land. And particularly as we discuss wildland fire, and climate change and the impacts, it's really important to recognize that Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by changes to both of these phenomena. So a little bit about kind of the area we're looking at. There are peatlands all over the world. My area of focus is Canada's boreal, primarily the boreal plains in here, and a little bit into the boreal shield of Ontario. So the boreal plains run from BC through Alberta and Saskatchewan down to the southern tip of Manitoba. The region's relatively flat, and even though it's covered in wetlands, it's got a really high proportion of peatlands. In much of the region, especially the boreal plains, the precipitation annually is actually less than the evapotranspiration that occurs. So hydrological connectivity is really important in maintaining the wetlands in this region. And it also means that this zone in particular is really susceptible to shifts in climate change. So why do we care about boreal peatlands? Why does it matter that they're impacted by fires? So these are really important wetland ecosystems. They're a critical carbon sink. They've been storing carbon throughout the Holocene. In Canada, peatlands make up only about 12% of the land area, but they store about 56% of the soil carbon. And if we look at it on a more global scale, boreal and subarctic peatlands, which are often looked at together, contain about 1/3 of the global soil carbon, but occupy only 2 to 3% of the world's land cover. So they're a really dense carbon sink. Globally, these boreal and subarctic peatlands store about 270 to 370 petagrams of carbon. And to put that into a bit of context, this is comparable to the carbon quantity that we have in our atmosphere and actually exceeds that of the terrestrial vegetation. So peatlands, of course, they're wetlands. These are wet areas, but they do burn. And in the boreal area, wildland fire is the primary natural disturbance. These ecosystems and wildland fire really evolve together over time, such that fire, if it is a natural disturbance in the area, tends to be beneficial to the ecosystems within which it occurs. So fire is important for a lot of different reasons. It's needed to release nutrients that have accumulated on the forest floor so that new vegetation can grow. It can maintain tree spacing within a forest so that we get a diversity of vegetation and animal life. And they also need to occur on a relatively regular basis, depending on the ecosystem, to clear out fuels so that we don't get these really catastrophic fires. So boreal peatlands are often dominated by black spruce trees, and black spruce trees really rely on fire to do two primary things. So the first is to release the seeds in the semi-serotinous cones that they have for regeneration. And then the second is to ensure that later successional species don't take over. So these are species such as the white spruce. And then peatlands themselves, apart from the black spruce trees, rely on fire to maintain the microtopography and therefore vegetation diversity. So we have hummocks or high points in peatlands and hollows or low points, and they host completely different vegetation species. And wildland fire really helps to maintain this microtopography over time. And in the boreal, these peatlands are highly resilient to wildland fire. So wildland fire does come through, but there are many feedbacks that exist to ensure that the peatlands and the benefits that they provide, such as this carbon sequestration and this carbon storage, aren't destroyed by wildland fire. But as we know, with climate change, fire regimes are changing. So fires are increasing in frequency, severity, and extent in this region. And then looking across Canada, our burned area has actually doubled since the 1970s. And in the last decade, we've had 5 of the 10 largest fires on record. So concurrently to this wildfire extent, severity, and frequency increasing, with climate change, the general trend is that boreal peatlands are drying. So this isn't true everywhere. There are areas where peatlands are wetting. There will be specific peatlands that are wetting, but the general trend across the boreal is that of drying. So when wildfires burn through these peatland regions, the majority of the carbon lost to the atmosphere actually comes from the peat and not the overstored vegetation. And this peat can smolder for many months at a time. It can persist through cold, through precipitation. Often we can see what are referred to as zombie fires. So these fires will overwinter deep in the peat and then come up again the following spring. So when peatlands are drier, they burn more deeply, resulting in greater carbon loss. And with this increasing aridity and increased fire severity that we're seeing, it's likely that boreal peatlands will burn more deeply than previously seen. And what some studies are showing now is that these drying peatlands, these naturally drying peatlands, are becoming hydrologically similar to peatlands that have been artificially drained for anthropogenic purposes. And this is really significant because past studies have found that drained peatlands lose an average of 8 times the carbon loss from undrained when they burn. And so this decreased resiliency of peatlands to wildland fire in combination with a shift in fire regime are really likely to enhance carbon loss during fires and undermine that resiliency of the carbon stocks within the peatlands. And this can exacerbate the positive carbon climate feedback cycle that we're seeing and possibly shift broad regions of peatlands from these vast carbon sinks into a carbon source. So there are a lot of micro and macro scale feedbacks that exist within a peatland system that interact with the global climate system. And these all impact how a peatland burns, where it burns, how severely it burns, and even what happens after it burns. And all of these come together to impact whether a peatland can maintain status as a carbon sink or whether it becomes a carbon source. So this feedback diagram here, we developed that ranks the feedbacks that occur that influence how severely peatlands burned, as well as the feedbacks that exist that are influenced by burn severity. So kind of pre-fire on top here, post-fire on the bottom here. Oops, sorry. And so the negative feedbacks are seen in dashed lines and the positive feedbacks are in solid lines. And the wider the feedback line, the more significant it is and the more kind of widely agreed upon it is. So there are some feedbacks that, you know, sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative, or some research shows that they exist, some research argues otherwise. And so those would be narrower lines. But just looking at this one diagram is pretty complex. There's a lot going on. So I'm going to break this down, look at some of the key research findings on feedbacks that exist in peatlands, and look at those in kind of smaller, more isolated feedback models. Before I go into that, though, I just want to acknowledge and thank all the researchers whose findings were used in our review paper and for the development of these feedback models. So we used a lot of different research that was looking at kind of smaller components of these. And findings in this area were produced by many different researchers, but really kind of key primary findings for our models really included those that were produced by Max Lukenbach, Brian Benscoter, Andrew Kohlenberg, Rich Patrone, Sophie Wilkinson, Mike Waddington, Merritt Turetsky, Kelly Hokinson, Nick Kettridge, Dan Thompson, and Gustav Granath. So I just want to really thank those researchers. So first thing I want to look at is pre-fire feedbacks related to the soil properties. And these really exist primarily in the catatalum or that kind of lower fully saturated non-living peat. And with these feedbacks, soil moisture and bulk density are really kind of the primary controls on both the likelihood of peat ignition, but also on the severity of burn or the depth of burn. So an increase in the depth to water table or an increase in water table fluctuations can really increase peatland burn severity. And this can be direct, where the soil is simply drier during a fire season. So as that water table comes down, in elevation, the peat at the surface starts to dry out, and we can kind of see that in this soil column pictured here. And this just increases the availability of peat that's readily able to burn. But the connection between depth to water table and burn severity can also be a bit more indirect. So deeper water tables or greater water table fluctuations can increase shrubification, which is kind of the growth of upland species that are coming into peatlands. It can increase soil tension, which really reduces a soil's ability to replace evaporated moisture. And it can increase peat bulk density. So hydrological connectivity is also really important, plays a critical role in burn severity. When we're looking at wetlands, hydrological connectivity really refers to the ability for water to move between wetlands, to and from groundwater sources, or transport via creeks, streams, other runoff pathways. So when peatlands become isolated or not well connected to groundwater or other peatlands or other peatland complexes, there are two things that happen that really increase the likelihood of a higher burn severity. The first is that water tables fluctuate more severely. So when they're hydrologically isolated, they lose their capacity to absorb or release water depending on environmental conditions. So when it's really wet, those water tables will rise rapidly because it can't kind of spread that water out. When it's dry, it doesn't have the capacity to pull water in from external connections. And then the other thing that happens is that the edge to area ratio of peatlands increases. And this really increases proximal water use from surrounding upland forests. So these upland environments are more readily able to pull water from that isolated peatland because it has the higher edge to area ratio. And this can further enhance drying, particularly around those edges or the margins of the peatlands. And then finally, with soil properties, there is a positive feedback exists where an increase in bulk density increases burn severity and vice versa. So when we're looking at bulk density in peatlands, we're really talking about the dry weight of the peat per the total volume as it exists in the soil. So a higher bulk density would indicate that there is a higher mass of soil in a defined area, and it's indicative of reduced pore space. So in the photo on the left there, it's a little bit blurry, but we can see that the peat is much denser than the peat on the right. And an increase in bulk density can occur for many reasons: changes in hydrology, changes in vegetation structure, anthropogenic disturbance or compaction. And despite the fact that peat with a higher bulk density can actually hold more moisture than that of a lower bulk density, higher bulk density peat can still burn more readily, perpetuate smoldering for longer than peat with a lower bulk density. It just has more energy in there to provide fuel for that smoldering to move through the peat column. And then in addition, because of the higher density of peat, significantly greater amounts of carbon are lost during combustion just in a given area. So then if we look at vegetation properties, these kind of ecological vegetative processes that control the depth to water table and influence burn severity, they're really complex. They're not linear. They all interact with one another. So I'm just going to look at some of the really kind of dominant key ones. So as I said earlier, a lowered water table can result in shrubification. So shrubification can subsequently result in increased transpiration and reduced precipitation reaching the peat surface due to vegetation protecting it. And this can result in a positive feedback cycle. Alternatively, an increase in shade can result in a reduced evaporation and a negative feedback. So depending on what the pre-fire conditions are like, shrubification can sometimes actually result in a negative feedback. Another significant influence on burn severity is moss community type. So boreal peatlands are dominated primarily by sphagnum and feather mosses when we're looking just at moss communities. And sphagnum provides a negative feedback response to burn severity. Feather moss typically is the opposite. So sphagnum mosses, these are predominantly on the hummocks or the high points. They really hold a lot of moisture. They have hollow hyaline cells that can hold that moisture and maintain a cool soil temperature, which really reduces the combustion potential. Feather moss, on the other hand, they dominate the hollows and they're significantly more flammable than sphagnum communities, and they really thrive in drier conditions. So a shift from sphagnum to feather moss can occur during shrubification due to that drying of soil, or just due to fragmentation, subsequent drying, and really increase that combustion potential of the peatland. So that was kind of pre-fire connections and feedbacks that really influence propensity for burning. Now shifting to look at kind of post-fire feedbacks. First, looking at energy balance. So boreal peatlands play a really important role in local climates. They can cool local air temperatures by up to kind of 1.7 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. So quite significant. So it's really important to understand if and how this shifts post-fire. And what we see is that there are positive and negative feedbacks that do exist following fire related to energy balance. So a positive feedback exists where an increase in incident shortwave radiation following combustion can result in greater surface evaporation and further drying of the peatland, perpetuating a future burn cycle. However, negative feedback mechanisms such as a reduction in transpiration, changes to albedo, those can reduce moisture loss. And so those can act as a negative feedback mechanism. Sphagnum communities can maintain pre-fire temperatures if they're able to reestablish. And kind of looking at it overall, negative feedback mechanisms in place here seem to maintain a relatively stable energy balance post-burn in many peatland environments. So looking at what happens in the soil post-fire, whether positive or negative feedbacks kind of dominate is really dependent on the pre-fire hydrology, vegetation, and the burn severity. So if peatlands are hydrologically well connected, they're undrained, that burn severity is typically a bit lower, and post-fire water tables can remain relatively stable. This can maintain a lower peat bulk density, and a low peat bulk density subsequently results in a more stable water table. So we have a bit of a cycle there, and this would reduce the likelihood of severe burning in the future. We can see this in the photos on the left. So this shows depth of burn. The top image, this is a fen that's really well connected to the surrounding peatland complex, while the bottom image here shows a small complex of raised bogs that have been disconnected by the big road, and then smaller industrial roads moving through the area. So like that bottom image showed, if peatlands are hydrologically isolated, burning can be deeper, exposing that high density peat, and this can result in greater water table fluctuations and higher likelihood of burning again in the future and severe burning again in the future. So just to show an example here, this figure on the left is from Kelly Hokinson's work. This shows a significantly greater depth of burn that occurred in a peatland margin. And this specific peatland margin was really hydrologically isolated and was experiencing really significant water table fluctuations. So there's also an interesting feedback that occurs during low severity fires where feather moss can become somewhat hydrophobic. And as I said earlier, feather moss is predominantly in those hollows closer to the water table. So when it becomes hydrophobic, it actually reduces evapotranspiration from the peatland, indicating that it can really hold in that peatland moisture and aid in peatland recovery post-fire. And we can see this in the figure on the left here. This is a figure from Nick Kettridge, and this shows post-fire evapotranspiration rates in feather moss versus sphagnum. So quite a significant difference. but it should be noted that this is just in low severity burns. So as soon as burn severity increases, even to moderate, this mechanism really just doesn't exist anymore. This is another figure from Nick Kettridge. We see that as soon as burn severity goes to moderate, feather moss evapotranspiration is pretty much equivalent to that of sphagnum, and then doesn't really change much as burn severity increases. Looking at vegetation properties, as with the soil properties, how vegetation feedbacks and systems are impacted post-fire is dependent on pre-fire conditions and burn severity. Low severity burns in hydrologically connected peatlands can enhance microtopographical variability, maintaining the diversity of vegetation. Sphagnum communities are able to maintain the soil moisture of the peatland and regenerate on the hummocks. However, if we get a high burn severity and or peatlands are disconnected from groundwater and the surrounding peatland complex, the functionality of these negative feedback mechanisms are really reduced. This can result in feather moss actually migrating onto hummocks, or hummocks can be uply converted into hollows. And this can result in a shift to an increase in feather moss, which can subsequently result in a shift to upland species. When we get an encroachment of upland species, we see a drying in peatlands occurring, and they can enhance transpiration as well. Looking at how this kind of feedback systems link to our climate system, climatic warming and changes to the period of snow cover in northern regions are causing major ecological shifts within boreal peatlands, and this can affect the directionality and the strength of these peatland atmosphere carbon fluxes that have been occurring. So there are negative feedback mechanisms in place that can mitigate an increase in carbon loss due to this increasing burn severity that we're seeing. So with peatlands drying, an increase in shrubification and post-fire, an increase in deciduous vegetation growth can really result in kind of a pulse of net primary production, which can cause kind of a short-term, strong negative carbon climate feedback. However, a shift from wetter to drier peatlands may increase future fire severity, increase that depth to water table, resulting in an increase of carbon loss to the atmosphere and a positive carbon climate feedback. And that would be over kind of a longer term. So based on all of the positive and negative feedbacks that exist in peatlands that influence and are influenced by burn severity, we get back to this kind of huge model that puts all of those together. And then we've simplified it down to two kind of systems diagrams. So this diagram shows a really simple summary of the broad negative and positive feedback loops that exist in peatlands. And of course, these are very simplified. There's always positive and negative feedbacks existing in resilient and vulnerable peatlands, but these kind of simplify down the dominant shift that we're seeing. So on the left, we have a really resilient peatland. This exists within a generally negative feedback cycle. So this peatland is hydrologically connected and experiences its kind of typical low severity fire. So it hasn't been anthropogenically altered. So soil moisture and bulk density remain stable. These unfragmented peatlands have low margin to middle area ratios and a thick surface layer of mosses, which also helps to keep surface bulk density low and moisture retention high. They have a high proportion of hummock dominating species such as sphagnum, which holds moisture even during drought and lowers surface temperatures, and also helps to limit the encroachment of upland species. These highly resilient peatlands may have black spruce as a dominant tree species. So these black spruce species have low stomatal conductance, which helps maintain the peat moisture. And then the sphagnum mosses also help to mitigate the lowering of the water table post-fire and help that peatland recover. On the right, we can see a vulnerable peatland, and this is what we're starting to see more due to climate change, anthropogenic disturbances such as harvesting, drainage, peat harvesting, as well as forestry practices. And so this vulnerable peatland, this theoretical vulnerable peatland, really exists within a positive feedback loop. And this is what we are starting to see occur more. So these peatlands have been fragmented and are isolated hydrologically. Their water tables are really variable, which increases the bulk density and promotes shrubbification. High burn severity results in a loss of hummocks and therefore sphagnum mosses, and really increases the risk of future high severity burns. So really, despite all the many negative ecohydrological feedback mechanisms that can compensate for increased carbon loss initially, the cumulative effects of climate warming, anthropogenic peatland disturbance and fragmentation, and peatland drying is increasing carbon loss to the atmosphere and likely driving a positive carbon feedback cycle. So just kind of a few key takeaways at the end here. So even though fire intervals are fairly long in the boreal, wildland fire is still the dominant disturbance. And there are a lot of negative feedback mechanisms that really protect the peatlands and the carbon stores, which mitigate the carbon loss that occurs during combustion. Key examples include feather moss becoming hydrophobic, reducing evapotranspiration and maintaining peat moisture, sphagnum mosses maintaining soil moisture during water table drawdown, and an initial growth of deciduous species post-fire, really resulting in that rapid increase in net primary production and for a short term at least increasing the carbon sink capacity. But most of those systems, as I've said, are really dependent on low severity burns and hydrological connectivity and historical climates. So as peatlands dry, are drained or segmented, these positive feedbacks come in that exist, which can really perpetuate the drying and future burning of peatlands. Most significantly is that feedback that exists between water table decline and an increase in bulk density, both of which really increase propensity for future burn, which in turn results in an increased bulk density, greater water table fluctuations, and we see that cycle really ramp up and continue. Thank you very much for having me, and any questions or discussion would be great at this point.
Thank you so much, Kailyn. That was super, super interesting. Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box. I'm not sure if we can unmute.
Sure, there we go.
Thank you, Kailyn. So we have a question from Scott. Are zombie fires a new phenomenon, or are they recognized in First Nations oral history?
That is a really excellent question. I don't know about the First Nations oral history, but that is something I would love to look into. It's not a new phenomenon, so they've definitely been existing in peatlands, I think, as long as we've been studying peatlands. But I would definitely have to look into it. Yeah, good question. Be interesting.
That is a great question.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. What's
Yeah.
I might have missed it, so please forgive me. There was a lot to take in, but the difference between a low severity and a high severity burn, what characterizes both types?
Yeah, I didn't really touch on that. It's actually, it depends on what you're looking at, and different people define it differently in the research. So really the key is to kind of define it yourself when you're looking at something. So with this presentation and what I was looking at, it's really the amount of peat combustion that's occurring. So a low severity burn would be one that doesn't burn as deeply. It doesn't eliminate all of the above ground vegetation that's existing, particularly the mosses. So we have the catatelum is kind of the dead layer, the acrotelum is kind of the living layer of the peat. So if there's acrotelum kind of left on the upper surface, it's more able to regenerate those peatlands. So really by severity, I was referring to volume of peat combusted kind of.
That makes sense. Thank you. We have another question from Fred. He says, how do you quantify the extent of a peatland's margin?
Yeah, really good question. So that's another one that's a little bit ambiguous. When we're out in the field, it's kind of something you have to look at when you're standing in a peatland, and you can really see that transition between peatland and upland. And that's really what we're referring to as the margin, is that transitional area where you still have peat soils, you still have some wetland species, but maybe the peat is getting less deep. You're seeing a little bit of transition to more upland species. Things are drying out a little bit. I think so. Around kind of the Slave Lake area, where there's really good examples of kind of these very distinct peatland margins. I think the literature said kind of about 10 meters is fairly standard, but of course this changes with every peatland, so you really kind of have to be there looking at it.
Are there practical ways to reconnect fragmented peatlands and/or prevent future fragmentation, such as culvert installation, road removal, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. I am not an expert on reconnection of peatlands, so I can't really speak a lot to that. That being said, it has been done, re-wetting of peatlands. Forestry roads, for example, have been removed to allow peatlands to reconnect with one another. One thing that is being done, I do all my field research is around the Fort McMurray area, and there's a lot of industry there. And one thing that they try to do to reduce the fragmentation of peatlands is when they put in kind of the compacted roads for access, is when they don't need them anymore, is go through and really kind of try to mulch up all that soil to alleviate some of the compaction, which can then allow that water to kind of reconnect through that area. Culverts also does work. The peatlands would still be kind of more fragmented as opposed to a giant peatland complex if you have a road running through it. But at least it does maintain some level of connection between them. The one thing that does happen sometimes that I've seen is that when they put a road through, even with culverts, is it can change the type of peatland. So going from a fen, which is kind of a flowing body, there is some movement there. If you put a road through it, it almost shifts it into kind of two bog complexes because the water is a lot more stagnant, even if it is connected.
Sorry, just going through here. Is there prescribed burning being conducted during wet periods to reduce the prevalence of damaging wildfires?
I haven't heard a lot of prescribed burning in peatlands. There's definitely prescribed burning happening in forests, and that's a really important tool. Prescribed burning in peatlands, I haven't heard except for research purposes. So there is like prescribed fires happening at peatland sites for research purposes, so they can monitor what happens. But I've not heard of them happening in peatlands just as general practice. The fire intervals, at least in boreal peatlands, is kind of like 270 years or greater. So unlike with forests where we really have a problem of suppression and we need to reintroduce more fires, what we're seeing in boreal peatlands is that fire interval is shrinking. And so I don't think that there's really a need for additional prescribed burning practices.
That kind of leaves, so Golden's asked, do the peatlands also have passive burning, or is it only active visible burning?
Sorry, I am not sure what passive burning is.
So I
wonder
wonder
what the difference is.
Yeah, I wonder if it
just
is, yeah. Sure. Maybe passive burning being within the peat, maybe? Is that perhaps?
Golden, if you just want to type in the chat what you're referring to as as passive burning? I could probably better answer that.
In the meantime, Jessica says, thanks for breaking down all the complexities and feedback loops. To the question of whether fire is good or bad for a peatland, it seems the answer is it depends. So do you have any recommendations for land managers that wish to prescribe fire on the landscape regarding peatlands, like to burn or not to burn?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I said, with the fire intervals in these landscapes being so long when compared to say like a mountain ecosystem or something, I'm not sure about recommendations like to burn a peatland specifically, but say you were burning near a peatland and you wanted to make sure that that peatland was well protected. Something that would be really important to look at would be the hydrological connectivity of that peatland. Is it moist and are water tables relatively stable? So if that fire runs through that peatland, is it going to just kind of burn the vegetation that we can see above the peatland and be more of a crown fire? Or is it going to really get deep into that peat because there's a really low drawn down water table or that peatland's really isolated?
So Golden's gotten back to us. Passive burning would mean something that is burning within the peatland, while the active one would be visible or even one created.
Yeah, so there's passive and active burning that occurs in peatlands. So passive burning, I guess, would be the smoldering that's occurring underground. And that's where we lose most of the carbon, is actually those passive burns. Is it also related to climate change? And yes, that's definitely related to climate change. So as we get those drier peatlands, those lowered water tables, that smoldering, the ability to smolder deeper into the soil column and perpetuate farther along the soil column becomes more significant. And what can happen is these fires can burn through the peat vertically, but also horizontally, and they can burn underneath and then pop up kilometers away. So we do see passive burning as kind of the main form of carbon loss, but there's also active burning that occurs. And this is kind of the burning that is a little bit more what we're used to seeing. This is like the crown fires, and it's really important in peatlands, like I said, for the black spruce, to clear out all that deadfall, kind of refresh succession every once in a while. So we do see both there.
Kimberly has a question. Is there prescribed burning being conducted during wet periods to reduce the prevalence of damaging wildfires?
Yeah, I really have to look into this prescribed burning in peatlands. I can't tell you a lot about it. I haven't really heard of land managers using prescribed burning to manage peatlands. I mean, definitely prescribed burning during, like for other ecosystems, especially in kind of northern Alberta. I mean, they do it during the winter a lot of times, so that everything's moist and it can't kind of get away from them. But I'll have to look into more and see if there's any good examples of prescribed fire being used for peatland management.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Jason's got a question. Can it then be beneficial for a peatland with a degraded upper layer to burn?
The degraded upper layer. Interesting. I guess it would depend on why that upper layer was degraded, I guess. I'm not sure that it would be beneficial for a degraded upper layer peatland to burn. I'd be like concerned that then it would get down into the deeper layers, because if the upper layer is degraded or non-existent, then what's left is that really dense peat on the upper layer. And that's kind of what's concerning, because that's when you're going to get that really high concentration of carbon that's being lost.
Fred's asked, what is the range between high and low water levels in a hydrologically intact peatland versus a fragmented peatland?
I think that is like very dependent. So the high versus low water tables. Yeah, completely dependent. I think for hydrologically intact peatland complexes, I think it's more to do with the range that you're seeing versus a specific level. So for an isolated peatland, you're getting flooding, so a water table that's at the surface. And then during dry periods, it's being, brought down to, 1.5 meters, 2 meters, 3 meters below the surface, versus these kind of intact peatland complexes that whole catacomb, or that whole kind of dead layer at the bottom, should be saturated for pretty much most of the time. So then you're seeing that water table more or less kind of, it depends on the peatland, depends how thick the acrotome is, but 0.5 meter below the surface, 1 meter maybe.
Jace has asked, does your research help in defining potential fire breaks for fire management planning, or is it being used?
Yeah, really interesting question. So my research, I am hoping to identify the landscape qualities, or what's happening on the landscape where the really deep burning is occurring. So yes, hopefully it could be used for that. So if we're looking at kind of these really deep burn pockets, why is X area burning significantly more deeply than Y area? What are the differences in that? And so then that could then be used to identify those characteristics on the landscape elsewhere to help prevent those really deep burns, because that's the negative implications.
Because we've got Kimberly says they use RX burning in Florida to prevent shrubification.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah.
What is
That would
RX
be interesting
burning?
to look at.
I don't know what RX burning.
I would assume that I just assumed that was like prescribed burning.
Oh, okay.
But I could be wrong.
That's me. Oh, it's just defined RX burning in Florida wetlands. Sorry, my chat moves when people add, so I have to look back up. RX burning in Florida wetlands. Prescription. Okay, that have peat soils like those found in the northern Everglades. That's really cool. Golden asks, how advisable is it to restore anthropogenically degraded peatlands? Are there any examples of?
Yeah, definitely there are examples. There are great examples within my study area. So the Fort McMurray area, of course, lots of those peatlands have been drained, lots of tailings ponds created, lots of industry up there. So they are restoring peatlands through wetting and planting kind of at a more rapid successional rate of successional species. It takes a lot of years to develop a peatland, because to be a peatland, you need at least 40 centimeters of peat. But you can kind of see them, they're restoring them as wetlands, and then you can kind of see that successional trajectory. There have been some successes. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but yeah, if you look at research in the Fort McMurray area, there's definitely good examples of it.
Okay. Fred says there are fire managers in the Northeast North Carolina using prescribed fire in fragmented temperate peatlands. However, he's not aware of any scientists studying impacts of that work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely want to look more into that now, because to be completely honest, I never even considered using prescribed burning in peatlands as a restoration technique. So yeah, thank you. I'll definitely have to look into that.
It's also interesting to hear all the peatlands more in the United States as well, because here in Canada where we have lots of peatlands, but obviously in the States they're more fragmented.
Yeah.
Garrett has asked if you've observed impacts of forestry and peatlands on burn risk other than access roads interrupting hydrology.
Yeah, within my own research, the only thing that I saw, like when I was on the field, was really those roads going in. But I do know that there are significant impacts of forestry. So when forestry companies replant, for example, they are responsible for the regrowth of their seedlings for a certain number of years, depending on their contract, usually with provincial governments. And a lot of that time, that means using a herbicide to reduce deciduous foliage growth, so that the coniferous trees that they're planting can come up. And that is extremely flammable. So there definitely are occasions where those forestry practices can increase susceptibility for fires.
Jessica says she works for a federal land management agency in the US. In the Western United States, prescribed fire is actively used so the focus is to how to restore fire to landscapes that have been decades of fire suppression while preserving peatlands, generally temperate, not peatlands. Temperate peatlands, not so much boreal peatlands.
Yeah, I wonder if that is because those peatlands are in areas where fire suppression has been so active. I'm not sure kind of what the landscape is like there. I guess in kind of the boreal, there's not a lot of cities, not a lot of habitation there. So it doesn't have quite the history of fire suppression, like say national parks or something would, where they're really trying to actively get fire back on the landscape. But yeah, that's interesting. I definitely have to look more into that.
And Laura mentions seismic lines too. So I guess that
yes,
would be...
that's a great point, Laura. Yeah, in the north, especially, seismic lines are everywhere. So those would have similar impacts as like forestry roads. Yeah.
I have a question if no one else has another question.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense from your research so far on what the percentage of intact wetlands are to those that have been degraded by fire?
To those that have been degraded by fire, or those that are like fragmented hydrologically?
Yeah.
Fragmented. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't looked into that. But I think that's something that I could look at with my data, and that'd be really interesting, looking at kind of a proportion of intact versus fragmented peatlands. It'd be interesting.
Jessica asks, when can we look forward to your published research?
Thanks, Jessica. I have a paper on this that is published, so you can look that up. It's the same title. And then my own research, I should have a paper coming out very soon. And then another one later on in the year, looking at the carbon loss from boreal peatlands.
Yeah, and I think we can put that paper in the chat if I can be quick enough to get it for everyone. Does anyone have any other questions for Kailyn? No? Anyone have any questions for the Society Canada chapter? No. Okay, well, it looks like everyone is thanking you very much, Kailyn, for your presentation, and it was excellent. And
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, with that, I guess well, what we can do is send around the link to your paper so that everyone has it, and put it on the SWS website and everyone can check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.